This is Joe Tucker, and thank you for listening to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks, the official podcast of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. And I'm president of the Academy. Today, I have a dear friend, close colleague, and immediate past president of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, Karen Burgess, on my podcast. Been trying to catch Karen because she is so busy and such a powerhouse. Karen is a commercial litigator in Austin, Texas, but she is everywhere. And one of the major things we're going to talk about today is, Karen, your dean speech that you gave in Beverly Hills in 2022. And it was about disinformation. And it resonated so well with me and all the members of the Academy. It was upsetting and informative. First off, welcome, Karen. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Joe. I'm super glad we could connect.
Karen, let's first begin with 2022 and 2027. In the 5 years since you gave that wonderful and inspiring, and at least what I consider one of the
it's 2025.
Today's 2025?
Yes.
Wow. I'm rushing.
I just don't want to promote disinformation.
Yes. I thought I'd start off with some disinformation. But since you've given your initial dean's address on disinformation, what has developed since then? And give us a sense for some of our non-lawyer listeners, what is disinformation as you would have us to understand?
Well, disinformation. There's all sorts of disinformation, right? There's misinformation where someone might mistakenly transmit information that they either didn't understand or didn't vet. And then there's disinformation where someone is maliciously, intentionally trying to mislead someone. And both of those are happening. You would have thought 5 years happened instead of 3 in between 2022 and now because of technology, basically. I mean, one of the things that's changed that's huge, it just happened in the last month. The polling for the first time showed that more people get their news from social media rather than not just television stations, but websites, apps, newspapers, any of that. More get it from their social media feeds. And so what that means is that we are getting...
You mean like X and Facebook and things like that?
Exactly. And so, as you know, there's that's going to be an echo chamber because of the way that the algorithm feeds us what we want to hear and amplifies the most extreme information. And that's why, for instance, MIT says that that disinformation is 70% more likely to be retweeted than truth. And so more people getting their news from that source means that we don't have a shared narrative, which is critical for democracy.
Yes, and people often talk about that we at one time could agree on a basic set of facts, and that seems to be no longer true. Help me understand, what is the role of social media in disinformation?
Well, and the social media uses engagement-based ranking. And so you're going to get more hits and people are going to make more, people who monetize social media are going to make more money from extreme content. So if it gets likes, dislikes, it doesn't matter if people like it or not, it's going to get amplified because it creates emotion. And so you get the most amplification of the most divisive content. And so what happens is what you were talking about, what is disinformation? You've got the kind that someone's going to give you because they want to sell you something and profit off of it. And then you've got the kind that comes from Russia, China, other state actors who would like to divide us. And as Suzanne Spalding said, if Putin can get a majority of Americans not to follow a court decision, he can cause chaos in our country. And so we're closer to that than we've ever seen. because, of course, if you create a powerful weapon like social media, smart state actors are going to use that. It's way easier than what they used to do. They used to have to kind of launder the news. If they wanted to plant something for us, they would go to a semi-reputable source like in India, plant the story, and then get their marketers or their PR folks to get it into US and Western news streams. That was really hit and miss, and it was a lot of work. This is super easy. We do the work for them. So,
Well, when
yeah.
you say we do the work for them, let's separate this into two different spectrums of disinformation. Let's deal with American disinformation and foreign actors'
Mhm.
disinformation. First, let's deal with foreign actors' disinformation. How does that play a role in what I hear, what I see on Facebook, and what I see on X or Truth Social?
Well, so it's really hard to divide them, first of all, Joe, because we can't tell, right? So for years, Russia has maintained troll farms in St. Petersburg, and they pay commissions every time one of their workers infiltrates Western social media.
When you
So
say
you
St.
can't.
Petersburg, not St. Petersburg, Florida, St. Petersburg, Russia.
Exactly, Russia. Well, and worse, so you can't tell if it's your neighbor. The mask themselves as someone, they could even be in your, neighborhood chat, right? Um, Worse, they have had troll farms in Ghana where they stoke racial division. So the Ghanans that they hire are in there talking about racial divides and police conduct and things like that. And they'll mask themselves as someone with extreme views, which obviously gets amplification. And then that causes chaos. It causes a divide. It causes division. And so that's really what they want. They don't care what we believe, right? They
Mm-hmm.
don't care. They just want to destroy democracy. And the way that they can do that is by getting so much division that we can't support a democracy. And it doesn't
Well,
even have to be overtly political.
what role is disinformation having in the attacks on democracy?
Sure. We know that, first of all, we know that that Vladimir Putin, he loves to use the technique called the fire hose of falsehoods. That's what Rand calls it.
The fire
Um,
hose of
Falsehoods.
falsehood.
He's credited with that. He floods the zone, the information zone, with so much misinformation that you can't determine fact from fiction. It's just too difficult for the average person. Even it's too difficult for the above average person to do it. So folks just give up and they decide that the truth is just fundamentally unknowable. And if the truth is fundamentally unknowable, then why even have sort of reasoned debate and democratic discourse? And so what's left out of that is just the political exercise of raw power. And so that's why Rand has called for, and Rand, by the way, was the Department of Defense outgrowth from World War II.
Yes.
And Rand has said that we need to change our definition of authoritarianism because our leaders are spouting, if our leaders are spouting disinformation and they're adding to the falsehoods, then we're getting to authoritarianism. And really, what we also see is we see Pravda, which is the Kremlin's propaganda arm, which, by the
Yes.
way, means truth, Pravda. It's flooding the internet with content. So you know how AI works? It trolls around and finds all this information and learns it, right? And so what Pravda does, they're so smart. What they do is just in 2024, they flooded the internet with 3.6 million articles so that the chatbots will suck those in and learn them in their AI large language learning models.
Karen,
And
that's scary. 3.4 million?
3.6 million just in
3.6.
2024. And they can generate more, they can use AI to generate more, right?
How then does the average reader, the John Q. Public and Jane Q. Public, how do they discern what is truth and what is fiction?
great question. I mean, you have to think about your sources. We have to be the credible sources. You know, we're trained in background checks, in fact checking, right?
Yes.
We got to support our journalists. You know, you and I have worked with journalists who are in exile from other countries, and that fourth estate is critical to protecting the truth. And we've got to support our judges because the courtroom has been the finder of fact setting for ever. And so we're watching judges under attack, we're watching journalism under attack, and we're watching lawyers under attack. Those are three of the main groups that can protect the truth.
How then does disinformation, and I'm going to go back and ask a question again because I want to get really deep into this. How is disinformation impacting our democracy here in America and around the world?
Well, so for our democracy here, if we don't, so Thomas Jefferson said that we needed an educated electorate in order to keep our democracy, right? And we know that civics education has taken a huge hit. So people do not, you watch it on the late night television shows, people can't name the three branches of government, right? So they don't understand things like checks and balances. So when people get disinformation about, for instance, a leader ought to be able to do whatever he wants because he was elected, when they get that, that's disinformation because we know that the Constitution has checks and balances, right? That we have a
Yes.
constitutional government. And if they get that information, it's completely understandable if they haven't learned about checks and balances that they would think that the leader they elected ought to get to do whatever he wants, right? And so that lack of a shared narrative, that lack of understanding the fundamentals of the tripartite government, coupled with the disinformation that's being spewed from our leaders that say, I mean, I'll just say it, our vice president. This, and I don't think this is a partisan issue, by the way. I'll tell you, there's lots of examples that it's not partisan.
Well, that's
But
that I want to make sure because I try and I know I fail to be on both sides of this. Is this a Democrat or Republican thing? It's just the Dems who are doing disinformation. It's just the Republicans who are doing disinformation. Help me understand.
no, so from a state actor standpoint, they don't care what we believe, like I said. So there's reason to believe that Putin was behind some of the disinformation about the Princess of Wales, whether they were getting divorced when she was really recovering from cancer. I mean, they just want us to get like worked up about things, right? But also recently, you may have seen in your feed a picture of Rachel Maddow helping out with the Texas floods. Rachel Maddow was not wading in the water in Kerr County. I mean, I'm sure she would have if that would be helpful, but it wouldn't, and it didn't happen. It was a deep fake. Um, Likewise, there's another deep fake of Greg Abbott
Or do you just
saying that
use the
we should
term?
deport the Mexican rescue workers that came to help, and that didn't happen either.
You just use the term. You hit me with the term, which I'm familiar with. Deep fake. What's a deep fake?
So a deep fake is when the technology gets better every single day. So a deep fake is someone using AI to create Joe Tucker saying something really offensive or making a robocall and telling people that voting day is a different day than it actually is, or that you should abstain from voting because of this or that reason. And it has gotten so good that the Brookings Institution says that we need to worry about its impacts on geopolitical actions, that generals could take orders from a deep fake voice. It's that good. And there was one of that Russia made one of Zelensky. Luckily, it wasn't in such a good. It was a couple of years ago, so it wasn't as good as it is now. Of Zelensky telling people to lay down their arms, telling
Yes.
the military to lay down their arms.
You had talked about state actors and deep fakes, and we were talking about what's going on in St. Petersburg and the troll farms that are there. Help me understand a little more about state actors and their role in this disinformation and these deep fakes.
Sure. I mean, they are working very hard, like I said, just on the AI generating 3.6 million articles. So what they do is they put those articles into the stream. They poison the well by poisoning AI. So, if you Google something today, the first thing that's going to come up is an AI answer, right? It
Yes.
comes up in the first paragraph. Never believe that. I mean, you could take it as a starting point, but no one should be believing that. It is coming out of things like the same machinery that got us Grok last week that was anti-Semitic, right? So, but they poison the well, and then they have this really efficient, really effective machine to sow chaos. So, a recent study showed that the top 10 chatbots repeated pro-Russian falsehoods 33% of the time. So you can really control the narrative if you can control 33% of what people are reading. It's this disinformation machine, and then we amplify it.
Well,
So, like I said, we're creating it.
Karen, do you think then there should be some type of government regulations on social media to help vet falsehoods and deep fakes? What role does the government have in stopping this and vetting this so that we are not being saturated with just false stories?
Well, as the sunlight comes in on me this morning, I'll tell you that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so the really good bills that have been proposed, actually, they're the same ones that I talked about in my dean's address in 2022 because they're still pending. Some of them have been tweaked to updated for current technology. Klobuchar has a bipartisan bill on it. Cornyn advanced a bill on
Tell us about
civics
those bills
education.
because I know from some of the emails and text messages I've received from some of our listeners, they want to know how they can act and what they can do to help move the ball a little bit. So I know you talked about in your dean's speech, but can you let us know some of the bills that are pending, that have been pending there for a while, which will help vet this and to make sure that we are not being deep faked and things like that?
I can, and I'm pulling out my notes so that I'll get the specific ones. First, there's one that has really gone off the rails, and that's Civics Secures Democracy Act, because, like I said, we've got to get people educated, and
Civic
we have to.
secures
So,
democracy.
Civics Secures Democracy Act, and Cornyn advanced it actually out of Texas, but it kind of got caught in the critical race theory debate, which it doesn't even contain a curriculum. But what you're going to hear from scholars, especially scholars who come from a national security background, is that we actually build public resilience to this kind of warfare, this cyber warfare, through civics education. And so not only can we support our bills like this, but we can actually go help teachers teach these classes, right? We can hopefully help spice up some of the classes with rule of law curriculum. And so you would be readily invited, I'm sure, to come and talk about those kinds of things.
Where
Now,
are these bills? Where are these bills sitting right now, Karen? Are they just sitting in Congress? Are they sitting in the committees? What do we do to help push this to write our congressmen and to write our senators and congresswomen and congresspeople to say
well, they're
that?
all in different places. So, we have the big bill, the big law that is complicated here is the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, because that lets platforms basically have immunity for anything that goes on, even if, as technology, that was written in the early 90s, that even if now those are really not independent forums. They're not just platforms where people are posting things randomly. The platform is emphasizing and amplifying extreme content, and so they have immunity, and that is one to fight. But there's one called PATA. That's Coons, Klobuchar, and Portman. That's the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. It is back at the Senate. There's one called the No Fakes Act is one about deep fakes that has basically the same folks behind it. Like I said, I think that we need to change Section 230 personally.
And I've heard that before about Section 230, and you sort of just talked about that quickly. Tell us the problem with Section 230 and combating disinformation.
So Section 2, so, we always want to be really careful about regulation on speech, right? That is not something that we like. And also, we have to remember that we have the Senate never seems like they're really the most savvy techno folks when they're questioning Zuckerberg and
Well,
others.
someone would say because they're a bunch of old farts who barely know how to use their iPhones.
Oh, I'm not excluding myself from that category. So I'll,
Well, you're
but
definitely not an old fart
okay.
when we look at the average age of senators and trying to get them to understand technology and deep fakes, which again is that's another podcast for another time.
Well, and I rarely agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene, but she did help get the AI regulation out of the quote big beautiful bill, right? Like
Yes.
and that was getting snuck in there by one of my senators, Ted Cruz, that we should have that we shouldn't be able to regulate AI at all for 10 years. And so, she did something great there. So what Section 230 does, Joe, to your question, is Section 230 is immunity for platforms. So, for instance, back in the day when the internet started, people would do bulletin boards and things like that, right? And they would just post. Maybe somebody posts something ugly, but no one was amplifying it. There were no kind of algorithms that were spreading it to normal people who didn't want to be in that sub chat of that bulletin board, right? Today, if you Google, okay, so one of the really big examples of this is wellness. And women have a lot of reason to want to go to the internet. A lot of us have a lot of reason to want to go to the internet for wellness because, for instance, the major studies have never included us. And so you look for other sources and people on the internet listen to you. This is another example that doesn't divide among partisan lines, right? Is everybody wants to be healthier, everyone wants to be well. Well, so you get in and you Google something about your condition, and the way that the algorithm works, it not only is going to sell you some tincture to cure what ails you, which is, you might say buyer beware, right? But because of the bad actors who are sowing disinformation, it will also take you down a road, if you choose to follow it, that will divide you between clean and unclean. And that gets us to eugenics. I mean, it gets you to a really ugly place. And, most people don't get there, but a lot of people keep going until they keep reading the content that's pushed towards them. And that's what 230, that's the problem with 230, is it doesn't account for the content that's pushed towards you as you are searching. And so if you're not a really savvy, skeptical, cynical viewer of your content, and you're now watching a video about how the government is poisoning, sunscreen, and so you don't put sunscreen on your child, and you think your neighbor who does is a bad person, that
Or vaccines.
or even worse, vaccines. And I have an unfortunate personal story about that. If you have time for it.
Go ahead, tell us about it.
So in April, Brian's my husband. Joe knows him. Brian and I got physicals. And so we go they take your blood in the morning, and they took our blood. And I grew up, my early years were on a military base. And my father-in-law was also deployed, but my husband was in rural Arkansas. And so I thought, I really wanted, we'd take our husbands places to trick them into getting health care, right? Sorry, Brian. But I wanted his blood to be checked for the MMR vaccine.
Hmm.
He's also a few years older than I am. I'm not really in the pocket of the MMR vaccine problem. Well, so they test both of our blood, comes back, Brian's fine. I have rubella, but no more measles and mumps. Okay, well, I'm about to go on May 1st. May 2nd, I gave a talk in Amarillo, which is the seat of where children have been dying from the measles because of lack of vaccine. So I freak out. I immediately make an appointment to get a vaccine the next day. I write to my mom and my sister and say, this is what I just learned, because I want them to check on themselves as well. My mom lives just west of Fort Worth. And my mom is a very smart woman. She was a teacher. She's well read. She's a very smart person. And she had never heard of the measles outbreak, which is a couple hundred miles from her. And
Wow.
when I sent her a CBS, I didn't want to send her anything that she would deem a partisan source. I sent her a CBS News video about it. She said they ought to say this on the news.
And you sent her to CBS News.
Yes. And I don't share a narrative about what is happening in the world with someone I love who's in my family, right? And it's not because she's not smart or wouldn't accept the information. She's just not receiving the information. It goes back to the whole thing of we're getting news from our social media feeds. And we have my mother would be a high risk person who would definitely need to get that if she were out and about in the world. And so it's something that you would want her to think about. And she was very open to it when it came from me without judgment.
Well, Karen, here's my concern, and I need you to help alleviate my concern. Disinformation almost seems like the air nowadays. You breathe like you breathe air all the time. You're breathing disinformation. What gives you hope with all of this that's going on? That's always my question I ask everyone here. What is giving
I
you hope?
know that's a hard one. And I watched a bunch of your podcasts. I've watched them as they came out, but I went back and watched the extra ones that I hadn't seen. And I knew you were going to ask me this, and it's a really hard one because I don't like false hope and I don't like to whitewash things. I think that we have to think really deeply about this. And I'll tell you that I think one of the things that gives me hope is this dialogue that we're having, and the way that the last 3 months of my presidency and your entire presidency and the next few will be of the academy is working across barriers, plaintiffs, defendants, criminal defense lawyers, prosecutors, judges, working closely with the ABA that we haven't in the past had a lot of work with, working with the college, working with the whole legal community to come together, amplify each other's messages, get the truth out there. And then the journalists that we've worked with who are in exile from their own countries, who are still reporting in their home language to their home people from here, reporting the truth and fighting for the truth. And like I said, the judges who are fighting for the truth every day, swearing in witnesses, excluding hearsay, and doing that in the face of personal threat. And that gives me hope is, like I said, the lawyers, the journalists, and the judges out there who are using our platforms to our communities and our clients and our civic organizations and the kids around us
Yes.
to teach what we can.
Karen, you've given us a lot to think about, and you've made us a little more aware of disinformation that it's everywhere. And we have to do our own individual work, and we need to continue to educate people because knowledge is key. I want to again thank you for joining us and informing us about what is going on in our world and the concerns that we should be having. This is the Rule of Law. The Academy Speaks, the official podcast of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. And I'm Joe Tucker, president and your host. Thank you for listening. You can find this podcast on any place where you get your podcasts. Subscribe and like it. Look forward to talking to you soon. And again, Karen, thanks a lot.